everyone, it's 314 React here, and it's been about a year since we looked at the 3D marks, ranging all the way from 3D Mark 99 in the Mad Onion era through to the Futuremark era with 3D Mark 2001 and 2003, 2005, all the way up to the very, very latest Steel Nomad UL era with the newest benchmarks that were released last year. Now, of course, the first benchmark that came out was 3D Mark 99, which used Max FX technology, and it was called this because it was later used in the game Max Payne. This was made by Remedy Entertainment originally. So if we go to Remedy Entertainment here, you can see that they obviously made Max Payne, but they also made a benchmarking tool, Final Reality, in 1997. And the team span off into the new sister company, Futuremark, which is why that technology exists in 3D Mark 99. Now, I've never looked at Final Reality before, but it's the direct predecessor to 3D Mark 99. So let's load it up and take a look. So I tried to get this to run with DG Voodoo 2 to get it to run in high resolution, but I was unable to, so we're just going to be running it in the original version. To install it, I had to install it on an old PC because it has a 16-bit installer, and then transfer the installed files back over. But here we are with the loading screen there, which seems to take a sample of what's ever behind it to give an illusion of some sort of transparency. So we can see the audio settings here, ranging from 8-bit to 16-bit all the way up to 44.1 kilohertz. You've got direct 3D and software rendering capabilities. You've got the advanced options here, which take you through the 3D graphics options. You've got texture bilinear filtering, Z-buffer sorting, texture mip mapping, texture trilinear mapping, depth fog, specular garage, vertex alpha, alpha blending, additive alpha, and multiplicative alpha, and sub-pixel accuracy. So from 1997, this is some pretty heavy-duty stuff. And we're going to be looking at how this runs with software and also with hardware acceleration modes. Now, this uses DirectX 5, so I think that was some of the issue I was having with DG Voodoo 2 and converting that to DX11. So what we're going to do is go through each of these tests one at a time, starting off with radial blur. Now, this is really cool. Nice little bit of radial blur there, just blurring that 2D image. You can see a little bit of the start menu appear at the bottom there. That seems to happen on every test, because it loads up in a very low resolution that I wasn't able to change. And then we go to the Chaos Zoomer, which is again another really nice funky 2D effect there, which looks really, really cool. Actually, it might be a 3D effect using some sort of texture blending or something like that. But again, you can kind of see the roots of 3D Mark 99 and even 2000 here with some of these effects. Looks really funky, very, very late 90s sort of thing. And then next up is 25 pixel, which I think is some sort of 3D rendering here. Some sort of very, very early fixed function pixel shader thing, doing some sort of liquid rendering. Then we go to robots, which is my favorite one. This is, of course, looking at some of the older games, possibly like Mech Warrior and stuff like that was in the mid-90s, to kind of replicate the sort of gameplay and looks that they would have. And it looks fantastic. Look at that animation, a little bit of specular there, a bit of environment mapping, I think. Really, really basic stuff, but it looks fantastic. It is so 1997. Again, kind of thing that reminds me of Beast Wars, and I absolutely love it. It's that kind of really simple aesthetic that at the time you'd see in a computer store running on a computer, and it just looked absolutely magical, even though now it looks quite rudimentary. And then we go to the fill rate test, which is a still test where it's just filling in this texture, I believe. And then we go to the city scene, which is basically like Blade Runner, which is probably the coolest one. It's not my favorite one, but it probably is objectively the coolest one and has the most rendering on it. So you've got the little environment map ship there, a little dome with some, they look like skulls, but I don't think they are skulls. Also environment mapped, you've got Aesir Corp there from Max Payne, sort of advert from Blade Runner there, and then obviously a direct advert for Max Payne there, which is really cool. I think this actually came out before Max Payne, so they must have been working on Max Payne at the time, and we're putting little references to their upcoming game in the benchmarking software. It's so cool. And look at that ancient way of doing clouds, just like a flat texture there. This must have looked amazing at the time. I think the resolution is like 640 by 480 or something. But oh boy, does it look good. I wish I could get this run in a higher resolution. If anyone knows how to get DigiViewDo2 working with this, do let me know. And then we have the title screen there, which reminds me of the title screens of The Fast and the Furious, which is quite funny. Of course, The Fast and the Furious came out in 2001. Okie dokie. And then we got the 2D and 3D transfer rate tests there, which I believe are non-functionals. They don't display anything. And here we are over to the results screen. And as you can see, my Ryzen 5000 series on my laptop is represented as a 3300 MHz AMD MMX. And you can see there's a little drop down there to compare to other systems. You can see we got the reality marks there. And we can flick over to the baseline system, which is a Pentium 150 with an S3 Verge, which seems to be worth about 1 reality mark, which is why it's called the baseline system. So that makes a lot of sense. So my system is 58.58, which would imply that it's 58 times faster, but as we know, it's many orders of magnitude faster. As you can see down here, there's database buttons. We can add the system to the database for comparisons. So let's add my system in here. Now I'm running an Acer Nitro 5, so we're going to add that in just as Nitro 5 and save that for future comparison. And you can see there it's available in the drop downs, which is a really cool little feature. And you can see the individual tests here. You see it's considerably faster than the baseline system, but not as much as you'd imagine, because I imagine the modern hardware is constrained quite heavily by the old DirectX 5 API, as well as just the general age of the software, and also possibly the software's ability to measure. It may be limited in terms of the frame rate. As you can see here, it says 0.37.35 kilopolys a second for my system, which isn't right. I think what's happened is it's meant to be 1037, but the 1 has been knocked off to the left and isn't visible, which is interesting. So it looks like it's less kilopolys, but it's not. So it's, yeah, it probably is about 1000. And you can see over here, overall 10.51 reality marks versus 1 on the baseline system. There we go, the 2D processing data, about 876 images a second on radial blur, and Chaos Zoomer is 829 per second. And oh yes, this proves that radial blur and the fill rate ones are 2D. And then 2D transfer rates, 703 megabytes a second versus 31. Again, that's probably limited by the API and the age of the software, because I imagine the transfer rate is massively more. And then there's the AGP tests here, which we're going to look at in a second. So this is a really cool set of results here, and sort of shows where they were going in terms of their results displaying and how they were going to move them into databases and run comparisons in the future, which is really cool, really ahead of their time. I don't know if there was any other benchmarks doing this at the time, but let's look into the AGP test here. You can select the amount of textures to run for the AGP test, all the way from 2.3 megs to 36 megs. So I think we can handle 36 megabytes because the 3060 I'm running here has 6 gigs of VRAM, so I think we might just be able to manage it. And what this reminds me of is the PS1, the music player on the PS1. It had kind of visualizer which had little square blocks in the background, very similar to that. And there's of course got a really nice rainbow effect and a nice little pixel effect there. I'm guessing this is just, yeah, loading up a quote-unquote massive texture, which would have been for the time, and just pushing it as hard as possible along with some pixel effects, just to test how fast AGP speed was. Now if you think about it, 1997, 36 megabytes would have been a lot, because I'm not even sure if any cards had 36 megabytes of VRAM back then. So yeah, pretty heavy duty for the time. And then we get the results through here. Now interestingly, the little bar, there's no comparison, but the little bar shows that it's not all the way up to the top. So there's a theoretical maximum there that they're sort of assuming you can get, and my system isn't getting that. It's about 75% of the way up. So there must be some sort of limitation there in the hardware or the API, or they just thought that the maximum was going to be about 350 images a second, and somehow no hardware reaches that. I don't know. I think it's just a limitation of the ancient APIs that we're running on here. So as we've seen, we can switch between software and hardware. So let's flick it onto software here and then run another benchmark in software mode. Now, this is where we get to comment over the main sort of benchmark here with the really cool audio, which again sort of shows the predecessor to 3D Mark 99 with the awesome music and the really cool abstract weird 3D rendering that's going on here. Now at first this runs okay. The 2D tests I believe are always run on the CPU, so these don't change in terms of frame rate or anything like that. So these two basically the same, Chaos Zoomer and the first one there, no difference in performance. But as we move into the 3D rendered stuff, we'll start to see really heavy hits on the frame rate, which is interesting because it's a massively faster CPU than what existed at the time. But again, I'm guessing there's just limitations of the hardware, well, the software, like the DirectX 5 API, stuff like that, that mean the old software rendering they were using just does not scale up. So even this isn't running too bad. And this is running okay as well, with the texture mapping. But I think just as we move on to the environment mapping, at some point the frame rate absolutely dives. Texture with environment mapping, there we go. See, it was running fine before then, so it must be, there we go, double-sided, transparent, dual texture with garage shading. That's where the frame rate also drops. It must be to do with how they're transferring the textures or rendering them on software side. It must be incredibly inefficient. And this doesn't have a great frame rate either, and really starts to dive again when those environment maps appear. And those lights looked a bit weird as well. Interestingly, it looks like there is bilinear texture filtering in software mode there. So that must be pretty harsh on old CPUs. And then we go to the Blade Runner one here, which will run really slow as well because it's got environment mapping on it. It must be that the way they load the textures and render the textures and sort them in software is just really inefficient. And there's no alpha blending there, no transparency. But interestingly, it still has the texture filtering. God, those lights are horrendous. Oh, there we go. We're above the cloud layer, which has no transparency. Oh, that's rough. So yeah, I bet if you were to look into the code of this and fix how it loads up different textures and stuff, you could get it running pretty smoothly. I can't even imagine what this must have run like on a old system. My Pentium 2 system is currently in storage at the moment, so I can't run it on that, but the next chance I get, I'm going to run it in software mode on that and see how horrendous it ran. Because I can't imagine an old Pentium 1, 2 era trying to render this with no hardware acceleration. There we go. As soon as the environment map's off the screen, it speeds up again. That's really interesting. Whew, that was rough. And then we get to the really interesting end here, which I believe has an environment map on it. But this actually runs all right. So I don't know why this runs okay with an environment map. I think it was the mix of environment map with a texture, wasn't it? or Gouraud shading. So an environment map on its own is fine, but an environment map with a texture just seemed to drive the frame rate right down. I love this ending bit here though, because this is creepy and surreal. Just this weird thing in the middle of nowhere in some sort of semi-liminal space. This strange mutated table thing spinning around. Creepy. Late 90s creepy 3D rendering. A lot like the T-Rex demo on the PS1. Really, really creepy. I love it. And that's where you can see the predecessor to the abstract, cool 3D rendering that they did in 99 and 2000. You can see some graphical technology companies there: 3D Labs, ATI, Creative Labs, Diamond, Elsa, Hercules, Matrix Graphics, Number 9 Visual Technology, SDB Systems, Video Logic, and Tritech Microelectronics. And Hercules, damn. George Broussard from 3D Realms, wow. Some people from AMD there. BitBoys, Citrus Logic, Cyrix. Man, I'd love to get my hands on an old Hercules card. I love seeing these old names. They remind me of looking through old computer catalogs and looking at all the different graphics cards in there, and the little pictures of them way back in the day. Over a quarter of a century ago. Damn. How far the technology has come. See, I think we had like 4 megabyte VRAM cards back then. Really, really old school stuff. And I think the software and lighting was still done on the CPU. So we've got the results from that. We can compare it to the baseline, which is still quite a bit better than in terms of 2D rendering, but in terms of 3D, really, really awful. 1.33 versus 1 on the baseline. Pentium 150, which shows how absolutely horrendous the software renderer is on this. We can compare it to the hardware rendered. 2D is the same because it's all on the CPU. But 1.33 versus 10.51. Again, you'd still imagine seeing a number orders of magnitude larger than that, but again, it must just be the limitations. So let's just save this as Nitro 5 software. And we have that for comparison in future as well. Really, really cool. So now let's flick it back to the hardware mode, thank God, and let's run the full benchmark and do a bit of a commentary through that, because we've seen it at the beginning there, but I always like to do a little bit of a commentary through it in real time. It's so old school, it's so 90s. And that present text appeared really quickly there. I wonder if that's a glitch. So cool. I haven't been able to find any documentation on this, so I'm not 100% sure what all of these are doing. There doesn't appear to be any white papers like there were with 3D Mark 99, 2000, etc. I did also look at some of the frame rate data for some of these tests, and I think VSync is on by default, but as you can see there, even sometimes the frame rate dips below the max frame rate of the refresh rate of the screen, because it was running at 144 Hz a lot of the time, but sometimes it would dip. And I did see it dip a lot of the time in the areas where there was environment mapping and textures. So I think there might be some sort of old school glitch with that. We'll see if it happens here. So you got the texture mapping running fine. And as it comes back, environment mapping. And then environment mapping and texture mapping. That's not running too bad there. I think it dipped from like 144 frames a second all the way down to 103 or something like that. That looks a bit slower. So I think there is some sort of optimization issue when running environment maps with texture maps. It could just be a limitation of DirectX 5. So I imagine if I was to force the VSync off in some way, it might bring up some of the results. And it might explain why there were some limits on some of the reality marks. But I think it's just such an old benchmark. And trying to get any sort of meaningful numbers out of it, especially with a system a quarter of a century newer, is pretty irrelevant. It's just more of a fun novelty looking at these old school benchmarks at this point. You can tell this runs much smoother. This is where back in the day, yeah, 97, not everyone would have a 3D accelerator. I think Quake 2 was just out, which I think was one of the first games to really use a 3D accelerator. So most people would have probably still been running the CPU back then. So it's kind of like ray tracing now, where you play an older game with ray tracing off, and then you buy a new piece of hardware that can do ray tracing, put it in your system, crank the ray tracing on, and really see that difference. It's the equivalent of what it is now. So look at all that alpha blending and stuff. See, back then it was alpha blending, higher frame rates, higher resolution, 32-bit color, bilinear texture filtering, anti-aliasing, stuff like that. And nowadays it's path tracing, ray tracing, really nice global illumination, DLSS, AI-driven stuff. And back then it was really expensive, and even after a few months, hardware become out of date. And then it kind of settled down for a bit, I think, especially across the 2010s. But now it's kind of gone back to that era now, where it's quite expensive and things are moving quite fast. And there we go, back to the weird spinny environment map thing. As you can see here, compared to the software version, it's got much smoother environment mapping. The frame rate is way higher, and it's also got either a planar or a semi-transparent surface with another identical 3D object below it, giving the illusion of a reflection. And it's also got shadows as well, which may be shadow maps, and that just wasn't present at all on the software version. And the little sparkly bits there look way better as well, because I think they utilize transparency. So you can tell the real graphical upgrade there from running it purely on software. Although it's still quite impressive that software was able to do that. Not to such a high resolution or anything like that. But it had the basics, it had the environment map that worked. So it's just interesting what software mode could do. Like I said, software mode seemed to work fine with just the environment map, as soon as you add in that texture map as well. Yeah, it's still a hell of an upgrade moving to hardware accelerated here. Yeah, I think each of those little sparkles are sprites. So on the software version there's really horrible colours on them, because I believe there's no ability to do transparency, so you're just seeing the full sprite with rendering the transparent bits as just black pixels. What a jump though, what a jump. That's what I love about hardware though, is where you can get these new exciting functionalities and they can improve what's already there. Kind of like moving up from Metro Exodus with no ray tracing to Metro Exodus with a little bit of ray tracing. and then moving up to Metro Exodus Enhanced with a full path traced renderer in it. And just seeing that jump up as you upgrade your hardware and upgrade the software, and see how the same thing gets rendered again, but even better. It's expensive, too expensive sometimes, but it's so exciting. And here we are again, the results page again, which is so cool. I really like this results page. Just the fact you can save to the database, flick between them. I'll have to have a look if there were any other benchmarks at the time. I don't know if there were. Yeah, basically the same results as before, so fairly consistent. The only thing there, the bus transfer rate seems slower on the previous run, and that's affected the reality marks a little bit. Don't quite know what's going on there. I seem to have gone up 23 reality marks since the last run. And then bizarrely there, the software mode has 79 reality marks versus 81 now. That doesn't seem quite right either. I don't think the original software run had 79 reality marks. It was closer to like 1 reality mark for that, so I think there may have been a bit of a bug there that's affected that. There we go, software mode. See 157 kilopolys versus 1,000. Yeah, it's hugely faster, obviously, running in hardware acceleration mode. The software acceleration mode seems closer to the baseline system, even on a modern-ish Ryzen. Again, software, pretty much no difference between any of them because they all run on the CPU anyway, on the 2D processing tests. The bus speeds there, really interesting. Much lower on the 3D transfer rate, somehow. And I don't even know how that's possible because the previous run on hardware also has the same sort of 3D transfer test, and then somehow much lower on 3D. I think this is a little bit bugged because some of this doesn't look right. And you've got 703 megabytes there, but the bar is lower, the green bar is lower than the purple bar. It doesn't make any sense. And the AGP test results there. I think this is probably bugged. I think this is the latest version of Final Reality 101, but there may be a newer version that I don't know of. Let me know in the comments, and that could be why some of these results are showing bugs, but it doesn't matter. Like I said, the numbers are so old, it's basically a novelty running it now. You're not really going to get any meaningful numbers out of this on modern hardware anymore. But there you go. That is Final Reality. Really, really nice piece of software from 1997. Great fun to look at. Leave a like, let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe for new videos. There's always a new video every week on video games and technology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.